This is a podcast with Graham Borthwick from Life Couriers and Chris Airy from SuspicionEngine.io. Welcome to our show, Leaders with Suspicions. I hope you enjoy.
Right, nice to meet you, Graham. So it'd be great if you could just sort of tell me who you are, where you're currently working, and what you do.
Okay, likewise, Chris. Nice to meet you. So, Graham Borthwick, I'm the COO of Life Couriers. We're a specialty healthcare logistics company. We follow what's called a buy and build strategy. So, we're bringing together different companies in the healthcare logistics space, and we're creating from that one company, one Life Couriers. My role as COO, I have global responsibilities. So, I'm leading our operations globally, which in this type of a setup is very much around defining the strategy, aligning people to that strategy, and seeing how we build the solutions towards that strategy for our patients and for our customers.
Well, we'll come on to a little bit more about your business in a minute, but that's quite a fascinatingly niche business, yeah? So what drew you to want to work in this specialist area of logistics?
So I've been in logistics itself for 30-something years, so more years than I care to remember. I started off on the customer side of the fence, back in the days working for Nokia when everybody carried a Nokia phone and we were growing. And that was a great learning place where I could learn about how we needed to grow and adapt and all of these sorts of things. I switched from being on the customer side to being on the service provider side after about 15 years at Nokia because I wanted to get some more diverse experience. I wanted to understand different supply chains. I found logistics and supply chain interesting because basically without that, things don't get into our hands, they don't get into our homes, and we really make things happen. We move things around the world, and particularly with globalization, there's a lot of opportunity from that. So I then built a career moving around different types of more general logistics, let's say. Did a little bit of healthcare through that. For example, running a life sciences hub, as we called it, running a control tower for a healthcare business. And as you get to my stage in my career, it's more than just doing the day job. It's like, what impact am I having? And that was really what attracted me to Life Careers, that this is an opportunity in one way to have an impact in building a business because we have a lot of opportunity, a lot of growth. But at the same time, I'm doing it in an industry where it's actually really impactful on the end customers. The end customer, in many cases, is a patient on a table who's waiting for life-saving treatment. So, nothing against the general logistics, but it feels like you're doing something more if you're carrying life-saving treatments than if you're just moving a pallet load of widgets. And so, it felt like the right position. It was a good opportunity for me to build something, but a good opportunity to build something in an industry that's giving back. It's almost giving back to society a bit on my part as well.
Okay, that's really interesting. So what kind of things do you deliver?
So we've got what we call 6 lines of business, and the 2 that may be kind of more esoteric ones, more interesting ones, are what we call radiopharma or stem cell. Radiopharma, these are radioactive isotopes that are used in either diagnostic or the way the technology is developing in future in therapeutics. So it's in cancer treatment, all of these sorts of things where these are products, these are things that decay because they're radioactive, so they have a half-life, and depending on what it is, sometimes that half-life is measured in hours. So these are things that we will take from what's called a cyclotron, which is where they're produced, and we need to get that to where it's actually going to be used with the patient. So it's very time critical. It's clearly because of the nature of it. There's requirements around licensing, how you handle it, things like that. It's perfectly safe stuff and it's packaged to keep it safe, but it's something that you have to follow certain protocols for it. So getting those to the hospitals, getting those to the patients on time so that they can get their doses and things, that's key for us. On the stem cell side, it's where we're basically connecting a donor and a patient. And so in that field, it's all about finding a good DNA match. So a patient will be diagnosed, for example, with leukemia. And there are organizations out there that will basically have a registry of potential donors that are willing to provide stem cells for patients. And so what happens is you'll take a blood sample from the patient and match that against samples from the donors until they can find someone that's got a good DNA match, so that any stem cells that come from the donor are more likely to be accepted by the patient's body. And so the real kind of critical part of that comes in when they've made that match, and then essentially two doctors anywhere in the world will then schedule the operations so that the stem cells are taken from the donor, get the necessary treatment and stuff. And then what we do is we will provide an onboard courier, which is a volunteer that we will arrange all of the transportation. We will arrange the different ways that they can get from wherever they live to wherever the donor is. They will take the necessary temperature controlled packaging for that. They will receive those stem cells, and then they have to fly or travel to wherever it is in the world that the patient is basically going to be waiting for them, and they will hand those over to the doctor at the other end, and then they'll return home. And this kind of connection of managing, understanding what's the most practical way for that person to do that transportation, what is the backup alternative if they miss a flight connection, or if a train is delayed, what's the second backup in case the first backup delay has a delay. All of these sorts of connections, what we're doing within that stem cell line of business is basically making those solutions, managing those couriers, understanding where they are, understanding that they're on time, managing all the communications around that. And so it is absolutely time critical. It's absolutely life-saving treatments that these people are moving. And so these are very specialist. It's a level of, if you like, project management, the type of solutions that we need to build, all of the details that we need to monitor, the regulations that we need to be complying with. You know, it's very important, it's very complex. And that's what we're managing as part of this. And what we're building in Life Curry is all around that.
A fascinating level of complexity, regulation, and micro logistics into quite macro logistics, isn't it? Yeah. You've got quite a lot going on there, right? So now, obviously, you can now run this, right? But tell me about your journey. You know, you left Aston University, but through that journey you've developed some skills. So what were the key moments when you found yourself challenged? Who helped you? You know, what made you, what did you learn? Who did you learn from? Yeah. Yeah,
so as you said, I started at university. I was actually very fortunate when I was at university that I was sponsored by a company that, whilst I was at university, got purchased by Nokia. And as I said, this was back in the mid-90s. When I joined Nokia, whilst I was still a student, we weren't number one, we were that follower, we were chasing. And so there was a real spirit in the company, and I credit a lot of the leadership at the time, the most senior leadership in Finland, who set a very clear direction for the company, but they also set a very clear expectation that we can do this. You know, they were setting goals that we believed on the one hand were unachievable, they were too far, but on the other hand, it was like, well, look at what we've done so far. Yeah, maybe we can do that. And that striving mentality, that approach was an important kind of foundational element for me early in my career. I was also very fortunate that I joined Nokia at a time that said they were growing, and that was growing the operations, it was growing the sales, but it was growing the culture. And there was very much almost a desire in Nokia to build one Nokia culture anywhere in the world. And so if you were a person who was willing to take that Nokia culture around the world and spread that culture, the ways of thinking, the goals that we had, the values that we had, the company was willing to move you so that they could develop that culture as we grew globally. And whilst I was actually still at university, I had the opportunity to go for a 3-month placement to Finland. Expected actually to find it fairly boring and stuff based on what colleagues had told me. I had a whale of a time. I had a great summer, really enjoyed it. And then went back to the UK, finished my studies. And so as I got towards the end of my studies, I had this opportunity that the company said, okay, when you graduate, we would like you to come on board and we'd like you to be involved in some projects. We actually need the capacity in Finland. So are you willing to come across, spend 12 months in Finland, do the job there? So I said, yeah, absolutely. 12 months, that'd be great. And then go back to the UK and settle down and, just continue my career. That was in 1994. And since then, I've not been back to the UK for more than 3 weeks at a time because the opportunities came around. Because when they said, okay, we want to set up activities out in Asia, do you want to go and spread that Nokia culture, be that connection between what's happening in Finland and what we're setting up in China? I'm young, free and single, and somebody said to me, would you like to see the world and we'll pay for it? Well, yeah, of course, I'll do that. And so I was able to build this career with Nokia, which took me around the world, allowed me to see different cultures, meet different people, get different perspectives. And so that's given me a very global perspective. In terms of, who's guided that along the way and stuff, very early in my career, I worked for an operations director. He was real old school operations director, sadly passed away now, but he was one of these guys that was very much focused on tough but fair, focused on the KPIs, understanding how we were doing, holding people to high expectations, holding people to high standards, but at the same time, recognizing when people were achieving, recognizing when they weren't and challenging them, but that fairness there as well. And one of the things that I learned from him, I was thinking about this the other day, that there's a phrase that he used, and I probably won't get the exact quote correct, but it was along the lines of, whenever he was talking to somebody in the organization, this would be anybody at any level of the organization, and say, we hired you for your hands and feet. We were assembling phones and things. But he said a brain came along with that. We need to be using the brain. And he was very, very key on that people had their ideas, they had their opinions, they had their abilities, and understanding people's capabilities was important. And so that was really formative for me very early in my career. But then the opportunity to start moving around the world and be exposed to different cultures and understand how people saw things differently, understand how people see different perspectives, different ways of looking at things, that really helped to develop me as well. So I've got a very global approach, a very open approach to see different perspectives that has come from that part of my career. Going forwards as well, other people have impacted me. As I said, I've been about 15 years in Nokia, and I felt that I had a good understanding of the mobile phone industry and kind of wanted to understand other industries. And so that was when I was open to, where can I get a job somewhere else? And it was actually somebody that I had previously been working with in Nokia who had moved to, as it was DHL that I then moved to. And she said, we need your type of skills. We need somebody who can help us to manage projects, bring some structure to what we're doing. Are you interested? And I said, yeah, I am. So went through the interview process and ended up getting the job, which took me to from one side of the fence, from the customer side to the supplier side, but it took me to Dubai, it took me to the Middle East. And I moved there to take on this job at a time that business was going through a lot of turmoil and a lot of change. And so I went there to run what they called a program management office, which was supposed to be managing the different projects that we had, the different programs that we had going on around the Middle East. But within about probably 12 weeks of being there, my boss said to me, we actually need you to work on some different stuff. We need you to help us to essentially rebuild the contract logistics of the warehousing business. Now, I knew kind of the basics of how the warehousing worked because I'd been a customer of that. I've been doing a lot of that work when I was at Nokia. I didn't know how to manage that thing, but he saw in me that capability. He said, I know you don't have the experience of this, but you have the approach, you have the way of looking at it to see what the problem is, to see what we need to do about that, and to drive towards the right solution. When I said yes, I would take that on. I didn't really believe I had the capability to do it, but it was kind of one of those conversations where it's like, okay, here's the choice. You say yes or you say yes, and I'll convince you at the end of this. This guy, Stefan, kind of led me to. But he was right. He saw in me a capability that others maybe hadn't seen, that I certainly hadn't seen myself. but by applying, in a lot of ways, what I'd learned at university, the engineering mindset, I applied that, and I was able to understand how the business was running. I was able to understand what was important for the business. A thing that's been important for me as well in my career was that I was able to understand not only what was important for the business from the perspective of a logistics company, but I just spent 15 years on the customer side of the fence. And for 10 of those years, I've been really close to 3PLs. So I really understood what was important for the customer. And I was able to help people in the business to understand that. I was able to explain to them why it may not seem important to them, but it was important to the customer, and why we'd be successful by focusing on that. And so that approach allowed me to not only turn around that business and be very successful with that business, but also to open me up to maybe there is actually a career path there. And I've probably spent more time actually now on that type of career track than I had in building up the expertise up until that point. But again, it was listening to somebody who could see things that I couldn't see and saying, okay, maybe they've got a view, maybe they've got a perspective that I don't have. And maybe I should try and understand that perspective. And from that, maybe I should just take the chance and take the challenge on this. And, you know, that's also something that it's not so much individuals, but there's been a number of points in the journey where an opportunity will come up. For example, here's an opportunity for a new position that will involve me or me and my family moving to another country or another continent. And what I've tried to do is to say, not, is this the right opportunity? But I try to say, why is this not the right opportunity? Why shouldn't I take this opportunity now? And by doing that, when I get to those forks in the road, there have been times that I'll say, no, it's not going to take me forward. It's not going to take me in the right direction. But typically I've found out that actually, yeah, this may not have been the opportunity I've been looking for, but it's come up now. And if I don't grasp it now, if I don't take it now, when will it come up again? And so I've often made these sorts of changes, these sorts of jumps. I mean, yeah, I mentioned I moved to Dubai for that position. That was the first time I had got a job outside of Nokia. It was only the second time I'd ever actually been to Dubai. First time I'd been to Dubai was for the interview. So I basically, you know, I had a family at the time, 2 young kids, my wife, never been to the Middle East. I hadn't been there other than for the interview. But I said, yeah, this seems like the right opportunity. There's the right attitude here, the people that I'm working with, there's the right opportunities for me to get the growth that I'm looking for. What could go wrong? Now, the truth is many things could have gone wrong, but many things went right. And it was being open to that opportunity that really helped me to move down the right path on the road, take the right choice at the fork. And as I say, it's not so much individual mentors along the way as some of these ones relatively early in my career that helped me to make those decisions to take that perspective so that I could decide not how does this build on what I've done, but what does this open up for me in future?
Okay, so just to explore what you just said, you've talked quite a lot there about you kind of had a why not attitude, right?
Yeah.
And then later in your career, obviously, when you got other responsibilities, you get more judicious and have to take other people to account in those decisions. But earlier on, it was kind of like a why not. Where did that come from? Were you born with it? I mean,
I don't know. Maybe, as I said, I put a lot of I put a lot of emphasis on the education that I had, not because of what I learned, because of what it taught me in terms of how to learn. I did an engineering degree, manufacturing engineering, which helped me to understand processes, helped me to build production lines and things like that. But within about probably 12 months of leaving university, I wasn't actually using that specific skill. But the approach and the structure that I learned from that has stuck with me, and I still use that approach today. So I don't know that taught me the why not approach, but it did help me to look at things from different perspectives, and it did help me to, if you like, deconstruct things. I think though as well, one of the formative things that helped on the why not side was again, actually, whilst I was at university, that this was in the very early days of Tony Robbins. He was doing, as he still does now, his different seminars. And I must have been about 19 or something, but it was actually my parents signed me up for a one-day seminar in Birmingham that I went along to. Who this guy was, if I'm honest, I didn't really fully understand the impact it was having on me at the time. It was high energy, it all seemed a bit woo-woo and things like that. It didn't really seem tangible for me. I'm an engineering training. What am I doing this for? But when I look back on that opened me to the ideas, or opened me to possibilities. It opened me to the idea that I could do different things. I could do bigger things. I could work on a bigger scale. And I think that opened my mind in a lot of ways. And so that's probably one of the things that created that why not attitude at a time that I was always also learning the structure that allowed me to create the perspective and the insight that allowed me to see where that why not attitude might be taking me to a shark pit or taking me to a good opportunity that was going to be the right path for me to go
on. Okay. The other thing I heard when you were telling me about your background and career progression there was a little bit about, obviously, I love logistics because they're usually full of big characters in different ways, but some of those characters decided and identified you and gave you a chance, right? Gave you something to say why not to. So I'd love to understand what kind of people leader you are and what you've picked up from them, but also you've been running regional teams, in the Far East, and you've also run now global role. What have you done about attracting and retaining talent? How do you manage and lead your people? What have you brought from those experiences into the way you now run an operation versus the way you used to run an operation?
I think one of the things that I learned, again, early in my career, I was in an organization in Nokia that was very flat. And so people were empowered. You had the ability to make decisions. You had an understanding of what were the boundaries in terms of responsibility, but it wasn't a situation where you had to always go and ask permission to do things. It was more of a ask for forgiveness than ask for permission type of culture, because we had to move at that pace. We couldn't be bureaucratic. We had to be moving quickly. And that empowerment is something that stuck with me. So understanding how can I empower people to do their job better? Being transparent with people, communicating with people, helping them to understand the impact of what they're doing, that's important for me as well. And in terms of leadership and how I lead people, one of the things that I try to do and that I've had a lot of success with in the past, it is around that transparency, but it's around showing people what is the impact of what they're doing on the business overall. It's not just what are the KPIs for your individual operation, but what does that mean on your P&L? So something that I've tried to foster in my teams and I've had a lot of success with is on a particular branch or a site or a contract in a warehouse or whatever if you like, the lowest level of the structure is, how can I make the manager or the leader of that part of the organization, how can I make them feel like a business owner? How can I give them the information that they need so that they can understand not only how is their operation running, how are they doing in terms of customer service, how they're doing in terms of quality, safety, things like that, but what does that mean on the P&L? Are we actually making money from their business? Are we operating as effectively as we should? And when I give people that transparency, when I empower them to make decisions based on that transparency, I found that typically gives them a sense of ownership, it gives them a sense of responsibility. And from that, they get a real excitement about that, about, oh, what can I do? How can I drive this? How can I be better for our customers? How can I be better for our business? What is the impact of what I do this month? And how can I see that when we get the results next month? And really driving that transparency and that communication down to that level as much as possible. That's important for me. Communication in general is something that I've learned over the years as well, that having regular communication with all levels of the organization. It's very easy for me, sitting in a position of leadership. I've got a broad perspective. I can see across the organization well. And so I can see things that maybe others will miss. And it's very easy for me to forget that. And I've got to make sure that people understand what is the direction that we're taking an organization in. Why is it important for us to go in that direction? What are the challenges that we're facing, and what can they do to help us overcome those challenges? What are the results that we're achieving, and what does that mean for them individually? So again, the type of thing that I've had success with in the past is the sort of regular town hall meetings where we take the state of the business and we share that with the organization. Does everybody join? No. Does everybody find it really interesting? No. But when there's a regularity for that, when people know that that's going to be there, I find that people do come along. They do listen into the bits that are interesting for them. They get the insights that are important for them. They get the opportunity to ask questions and to know that leadership is listening, management is listening. And that's something that when I do that type of communication with my teams, when I do that with the organization, it's also important to me to be seen to listen, so to take feedback from people and to bring back the results of that. I find that the best way to show people that I'm listening is to show them what I've done with that, to show them how I've acted on that by taking action or by explaining to them why I can't take action, but here's the reason why we can't. And just letting people ask a question and letting it die in a black hole, that doesn't work. You've really got to take ownership and show that person in an organization who feels that they're too far removed from management, show them that, no, you're not too far. We do listen to you, we do value your opinion, because actually it's not that you're too far removed, you're actually much closer to where the real problem is or what the situation is. And therefore you have an insight that I don't have. In my position, it's easy to take that broad view and look across the business. But I've also got to balance that with looking into the details and getting close to people within the team and recognizing the transparency, the visibility that people within the team have, recognizing where there are different perspectives in the team. So some people can see things one way, other people will see things a different way. Why are they having those different perspectives? How do I help the team to understand those different perspectives? How do I provide the insight? How do I provide the transparency or the direction so that we can move in the same direction, so we can move towards whatever our goal is? But really that focus on transparency, that focus on communication is key for me.
So that all makes perfect sense. My question would be, when you join this role or any role, you inherit a team, don't you?
Yeah.
And it's not like a Premier League football club that may have some billions to replace the entire team, right? You have to work with the people as you find them. So could you bring to life, just for the listeners, they may, depending on their organization and different sizes, you always inherit a team and you have to make them believe in something, maybe a bit different, maybe completely different. Yeah. And you talked about transparency and the way you like to work. How do you move them from where they're at to that new way of working as a team?
So, as you said, people have got to believe in something, and I see that as twofold. First of all, it's setting the direction, either understanding what that direction is for a company, what strategy is already there that we need to align to, or how do we build that strategy that we're then going to align to. I've been in both situations in my career. But the other part to me is, how do they believe in themselves? I mentioned earlier people who believed in me when I didn't necessarily believe in myself. One of the things that I focus very much on is a strengths-based mentality. So don't focus on what your weaknesses and how do you compensate for them, but really understand, what are you good at? What are your strengths? Because in my experience, by focusing on my strengths, by really understanding where I am different, where I am strong, to be honest, where I am better than others in certain respects, how can I then apply that? And so that's something that when I inherit a team, I want to understand with that team, what are their strengths? What are they looking for? What's important to them? And through that, how can I align them? How can I help them to have an impact on that business goal that we're aiming for, that belief that we're going for? I think part of this, again, it was a formative experience type of situation that I had, because it comes from when I had my first line management position. I was, first of all, building a team and, trying to find the right people to build my team so that we could really have an impact, really fired up and stuff. And there was a guy that, if I look at it from the technical perspective, he had the skills that were needed in my team. And I think he'd have been capable of delivering what was needed for the team. The problem was, I didn't spend time to understand from him, did he actually believe in where we were going? Did he understand the goals of our organization, our part of the picture? Did he believe in that? And the sad truth is, he wasn't aligned that way. But because I was so focused on his technical skills, I spent a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to convince him that he would be the greatest addition to our team and do great things together. He didn't see them as great things. It wasn't where he wanted his career to go. And so I learned that the hard way. I learned that by essentially wasting my time on him, when what I should have done is said, okay, I need to understand what's important to you, see if that's aligned to what's important for us in the organization, recognize that it's not, and move on to someone else. But when I reflected back on that, it really helped me to understand that understanding where we want to go and building that belief in something, yes, that's important. Having clarity of the goal, understanding what's the North Star that's guiding us, being able to explain that to people, that's key. But if the people themselves, they don't understand why that's important, if they don't understand their part in that, if they don't believe they can have an impact on that, it's very hard to motivate them. It's very hard to get the right results from them. And a lot of energy and a lot of time gets wasted on that. So I need to make sure that they do understand that, they do believe in their importance for that. They believe that I'm listening, they believe that I'm supportive for them, they believe that I'm empowering them, so that we can then start driving forwards together.
Okay. And you've got a global role. So I'd be interested about how you do that, because you could, I don't know, you see many types of people who are permanently on a plane flying around the world, and you see other people who sit in head office on a Zoom, right? And you talked about town halls, which are probably better done by a Zoom type thing rather than whatever. But how do you mix that up? How do you be present and always available to a broader audience, right? There's a balance there, isn't it? What's your mix?
There is. I mean, I do spend a lot of time on planes and getting in front of people, and especially in this role, because we're building so much, it's important to be there, to get in front of people, to be listening to them and things like that. But at the same time, I can't be everywhere. And so I try and balance it in terms of regular reviews to understand how things are going. So I have weekly one-on-ones with my key direct reports. They then cascade those down to their direct reports and so on and so forth, so that we've got these regular touch points to understand the progress on different projects, to understand what challenges we might be facing. And that I find complements, maybe the wrong words, complements, is it complements that FaceTime, that in-person work. I've found that that's important over the past years and stuff, because if I don't put those regular touch points in place, the regular Teams calls in place, it gets very easy when you're in a multi-geography position. It gets very easy to only focus on where are the fires, where are the problems. And I don't get the early warning signs. I don't get the chance to recognize, where are things going well. One of the challenges that I see in operations in general, we're great at recognizing and patting on the back those people who fix problems, but we never do that for the people that avoided the problems in the first place. So how do I make sure I find out who's actually avoiding the problems, and I give them the recognition, I give them the support, because they're the ones that are actually having more success than the guy who got themselves into trouble and managed to get themselves out of the trouble. Because not getting into that trouble in the first place, I find, is always a much more successful way of doing it. So that's where the one-on-ones come into it. But another thing that I do as well, and again, learn from the hard way, is when I do travel, I try where possible to have half a day or a day, not necessarily a lot of time, but enough time that isn't structured. It gets very easy, jump on a plane, I go somewhere, I've flown halfway across the world to get there. It's expensive in terms of money, it's expensive in terms of time, so I cram it full with meetings. And when I think I used to do that, and I found that there would be times that meetings get cancelled and you get these gaps that appear in the schedule. And because I'm just sitting there at a desk in an office in a place I'm not normally working in, people come up and chat. The proverbial water cooler conversations, they start happening, which they can't happen over Zoom or over Teams the same way. You need to be there. And so I now consciously build that into my schedule. One of the places that I travel to frequently in this position is to St. Louis, where we have a regular connection, a flight connection on a Sunday. We'll often have meetings starting on a Tuesday so that people from around the States are not traveling on the weekend. I deliberately take that Sunday flight, so I've got that Monday to actually just be there in the office. Yes, I'll arrange some meetings, but I'm not jamming my day full. So I've got the opportunity to catch up with people. I've got the opportunity to have that informal discussion of things. And that's the type of balance that I like to get between structured discussions, which can be done in person or can be done through Zoom or Teams or whatever, versus the informal, on the ground, catching up with people. I see that I need to get both of those sides of that whole balance, if you like.
Yeah, I think balance is a good word there. And I think you're talking very much about sort of having enough time to pick up the non-clear signals as well as the stuff you can manage through KPIs. But let's just flip into the more formal side of it then. So what tools and systems have been game changers in your career and in your current role for actually being able to manage a complex organization through data? Let's understand a little bit about the formal side that you do balance with the people side.
Yeah, so I think in terms of operational data, one of the key points for me is really understanding what productivity we really have when it comes to resources. And the thing that I find is that people often confuse productivity with output. Just because we have more output, are we really more productive? So that's a metric that I've used throughout my career in logistics. What are we getting out versus what are we actually putting in to create that output? So that's always been a key operational metric for me. In my current role, as I mentioned earlier, it's all about getting that thing to the patient on time. So quality and quality of service, timeliness of service, those are the types of metrics that are critical for us to make sure that we are executing correctly. And as I use these KPIs, as I get the insight through the data, something that I also focus on that I've learned is important is how do we understand the variability of the process? Because if a process is consistent, if we can execute that process consistently, time after time, delivery after delivery, we get a predictability. And that predictability allows us to plan for the process. It allows us to make commitments to customers and commitments to patients ultimately. And when we have that predictability, that's when we can then use these other metrics to say, okay, how can we now further improve the process? If the process itself is unpredictable, if we start taking actions to improve the process, we don't actually know if it's those actions that have made a change in the process performance or if it's just random. And so really using KPIs, steering the business to get that insight into the predictability and then using that to understand where the improvement opportunities are, that's really important to me. Another key point as well, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the KPIs, is getting beyond just the operational KPIs. I've worked with a lot of people who are strong operators. They're used to being in a situation where they have their on-time delivery results, they have their inventory accuracy results, they have their quality results, but they've not been given the P&L data. They've not been given the profitability data, the understanding of their costs, or these sorts of things to know what is it that is actually creating this operational output am I being effective with that? How can I use the resources that I have more intelligent? How can I be more cost effective with what I'm doing? So getting those KPIs, putting them in a way that that operator can understand, because when you first get that P&L, it's usually a lot of numbers. It's in a language that finance people understand, and that operator doesn't understand. So understanding what are the key metrics within that, such that an operator can, through that, learn how to interpret, read the P&L, interpret what are the most important cost lines, for example. What are the ones that really are under their direct control that they can have a real impact around? And what do those cost lines mean in terms of those operational metrics that they're so used to? And then working with people to get that visibility, to get that understanding, to drive the business forwards and say, if we adjust this part of the process, this process that we spent the time to understand, what do we see as the impact in terms of an operational KPI? But what do we see as the impact in terms of a business KPI? And are those both moving in the right direction? That's very important to me, and driving that type of a culture within a business and driving that data-driven mentality is really important for me, so that we can move forwards in the right direction and at the right speed.
So logistics is one of those realms where there are usually a lot of disaggregated data sources, yeah, and it can be quite tricky to bring them together. And you've just added another layer on there in trying to bring sales-related and revenue and commercial data into that dashboarding capability, yeah. So have you managed to wave a magic wand and find some technology that does that, or are you cobbling things together, or what's that look like?
A lot of it, yeah, it's taking what's already there and cobbling things together, as you put it, which in some ways is also a conscious decision on my part. I started my career in technology. I think there's a lot to be gained from technology. But I've always said, if you can't manage the process on a whiteboard, you don't understand it well enough. And so looking for the magic bullet in terms of dashboarding and things like that, there's plenty of salespeople out there who will tell me that their solution, their tool will give me everything I need. But if I don't really understand that process, how do I know how to automate it? How do I know what are the most important metrics for that dashboard? And so, to be honest, a lot of it has been trial and error over the years, understanding what's available, understanding and trying to dig into them and see what happens if I push here, what happens there, and just that trial and error of cobbling things together. Is that the most effective way? Not necessarily. Is it the most efficient way? Certainly not. But at least by doing that, I get the understanding, which allows me to understand the underlying business, to get visibility to the underlying business, that we can then build some automation around, that we can then build a dashboard solution around. But it's important to me to take that process first approach rather than a technology first approach.
Yeah, okay, very understandable. So for the listeners, could you give some examples of your productivity KPIs? Because it's quite hard to imagine what they may be if you've not done them before.
Yeah, I mean, in logistics, it's simple things like a shipment. What are the number of shipments that we have per FTE per hour, for example? So if we have somebody working in a dispatch department and they are managing different orders and the shipments that come from those, how many orders have they managed, let's say, in an 8-hour day? And for that, an FTE is a full-time equivalent. So if they've been working all day, 8 hours on that, and then that is one FTE, and how many orders have they managed? So for example, they've had 40 orders today, they've been working 8 hours, so they've done 5 orders per hour on a full-time equivalent basis. Is 5 orders per hour a good result, a bad result? Well, let's measure this over time. Let's understand this over time and see how we can improve this. Did they do 4 orders yesterday and 10 orders tomorrow? How is it changing? How's it going up and down? That's the type of thing. So that, when I talk about productivity, that output being the number of orders that they've worked on relative to the input, how many minutes, hours, days have they put into that? That comparison between the two is what's important. And again, as I said, a lot of people, when they start looking at this, they'll say, okay, how many orders did you do? Oh, I did 40 orders today. Okay, good. And How many orders did you do yesterday? Oh, I did 50 orders yesterday. Okay, so does that mean that you did more yesterday? Well, no, I had to do a lot of hours of overtime yesterday. So I ended up working 12 hours. So it took me 12 hours to do those 50 orders instead of 8 hours to do the 40 orders today. And, you know, understanding that ratio between the two has always been important.
Okay, so presumably in your business you have multiple different product and service lines, which probably have different pick, pack, dispatch, and logistics elements to them. So it's not. I guess there's no vanilla generic measure of productivity, but as you said, it's more about for each of those units and steps in the process and product lines. Really, how are the ratios changing, and what does that mean? I guess is that.
It is, yeah. You're right. There is no silver bullet that one size fits all in terms of metrics. And again, that's something I've learned over time, that it's important to understand a specific process and understand what's the right unit of output that we should be focusing on, what's the right unit of input that we should be focusing on, you know, what's really the workload driver in that process or in that part of the process. And then getting the visibility into that and understanding how that's changing over time, understanding how that's varying over time between people, between different service lines, and what can we learn from that? How can we, where possible, take best practices from one service line to another, but also understand the differences between them? Because, as you say, there's differences there, and you know that's something again that I've learned in the past, that if I try to take a best practice process in terms of one that has the highest number on a metric, it may not be the best practice. It might just be that there are certain traits of that process that make it more predictable and therefore make it easier to execute, easier to automate. And from that, we get a higher productivity. That doesn't mean it's inherently better than another one. It just means that it's got a different personality to the process, essentially.
Great. Let's shift tack a little bit. So I'm interested about how leaders balance priorities. So and I'll ask you, what's your biggest operational challenge right now? What's your biggest strategic challenge right now? Yeah. And how do you balance your time between solving them both?
In terms of the biggest strategic challenge, which then links back into the operational challenge, the biggest strategic challenge right now is what we're doing in terms of the big picture. So getting the organization aligned, bringing teams together, getting common direction set and making people understand what is their impact on that and how should they be working towards that. What can they do to drive to improve their own activities? What can they do to help colleagues that maybe they don't even know yet? And in terms of, you know, that then comes down to the operational challenge. One of the key challenges that I have in my role, because of where I sit in the Life Careers Holding, I'm bringing together these different companies. And so I'm bringing together people that historically may have had no connection with each other. They're in different continents, they're in different business lines, but we've got opportunity with that. We've got people that want to expand their business, and so they want to bring in new service lines, new lines of business. How do we understand what those opportunities are operationally? How do we understand where our strengths are operationally? And how do we, through that, help people to understand that what may be something that seems to be important today in their operations, is it really that important? Is it aligned to the strategy overall? Because of the way that we operate, I'm not involved in a lot of the day-to-day operations. I have people that are involved in those processes. They have responsibility, they have ownership, they have accountability for those processes. And I'm not going to tell them how to do their job, because they are, in many cases, they've got decades of experience in those specific niches that I talked about. These are very, very specialist types of logistics. I can't tell them how to do their job better. So getting into those types of operational day-to-day challenges is not something that really I can spend a lot of time on, because I just don't have the skills for that. But what I can spend time on is understanding who's good at that, and who can take their knowledge and who can help others, who can step out of their comfort zone, step out of their area of direct responsibility, give them greater responsibility to help us to solve operational challenges that we have in another part of the business where maybe those people have never connected before. There's something that I find myself doing a lot in life careers is really just joining the dots between people. I get the chance, as we talked about, I get the chance to travel a lot. I get the chance to meet people. And so there's a lot of really chance opportunities that come up in conversations. And how do I help people with their operational challenges, not by helping them myself, but by pointing them in the direction of someone who actually has got that expertise, who has got that business knowledge. And then linking that back to the strategy, how do I do that in a way that allows us to bring the business towards the strategic challenge that we have, which is very ambitious growth targets. We will not achieve the growth targets that we have by operating as a bunch of independent entities or working by themselves. We need to be working together. We need to be moving towards common goals. We need to be, as we say, keeping it in the family. So leveraging where we have company A in country one, learning from company B in country two so that they can expand their business, because it's much easier to learn from a colleague in another company than it is to go out and learn that from scratch. So how do we make these connections and how do we grow the business that way? That's the operational challenge, is making the connections for people. And that then allows us to address the strategic challenge, which is growing and developing our business and developing our service lines.
Amazing complexity there of inorganic growth, integration, and trying to grow particular service lines as well. So must keep you busy. So just for our closing section now, just what advice would you give people thinking about a career in logistics versus something else?
That's a good question. I think people need to understand, in some ways, the complexity of logistics, but in other ways, the simplicity. I think we're very good in logistics at making things seem more complicated than they are. You know, we think that what we do is unique. We think that what we do is a challenge, but at its core, in my view, logistics is very simple. You've got to move something from A to B and don't drop it or lose it on the way. But what are the opportunities with that? What are the complexities with that? How do we control those complexities? If you're moving into, or you're looking at a career in logistics, understand how can you bring that insight to that? How can you bring maybe knowledge, expertise that you have? How can you see through some of that superficial complexity to see what's important there? Why is that important for you? There are a lot of daily operational challenges, especially if you're starting out in logistics. There's going to be fire after fire that you need to deal with. And that brings a lot of stress. It brings a lot of challenge. And you've got to understand the big picture of why am I doing this? And to me, as I said earlier on the call, what's really interesting about logistics is what we're achieving, what we're enabling, what we're making happen. You know, I was fortunate enough to build my career at a time that globalization was huge. The idea that we can build a widget in China and ship that halfway around the world and get that into somebody's hands in a shop in really a matter of days, that's really exciting to me. And the opportunity to drive that type of supply chain, that's really interesting. Now, things have changed. You know, the world has become more complex since then. That brings more challenges. But understanding the signal versus noise, understanding which of those challenges are really impactful for us, and therefore focusing our attention on them, building a career, building the problem-solving activities around those challenges, and what we can do with that. That's where the excitement of logistics comes. And you know, to go back to someone looking at this, looking at a career in logistics, be ready for those challenges, know that they're going to be there, but also understand what you can do, how you can take ownership to address those challenges and to work with those challenges and to work around them. And a lot of the challenges that we face in logistics, they're not things that we can necessarily fix ourselves. You know, if you go back over the last 5 years or so, pandemics and ships getting stuck in the Suez Canal and wars in Ukraine, and you know, there's all these sorts of things that have had massive upheaval on the supply chain. And we've had to work around that. We've had to come up with solutions. We've had to come up with solutions in terms of inventory levels where we'll stock things, or routings that we'll take to get products to market, or all of these types of things. Could we, within the logistics and supply chain industry, have stopped any of those challenges? No way we could have stopped them. But we have to work around them. And that's where a lot of the excitement is for me, is how do we deal with those things? How do we remain responsive to those situations? And that's also important. How do we keep responsive to them, not just reactive to them? How do we understand the challenge? How do we understand how to work around the challenge, and what are the opportunities from that? And I think if you bring that approach to logistics, that see them as a challenge and therefore an opportunity to work around, there are great opportunities in logistics. You can have a great career in logistics. As I said, I've spent 30 plus years now living around the world, experiencing different cultures, meeting different people, doing really impactful things. And as you start out in a career in logistics, those opportunities are there. If you see the challenges and you face them head on, if you see the opportunities that you can have on those challenges, if you feel empowered and you take that empowerment, you take accountability, I think it's a great career that people can work in and people can focus on.
Well, thank you, Graham. I think there's been a lot in that in this session that people can take a lot of value from, in terms of their approach to being open-minded, their approach to taking risk as opportunity, learning from other people, blending data with the day job. And I think most importantly for me is in terms of logistics, is you can plan all you like, but there's a real world out there. So
yeah. Thank
So,
you, Chris. It's been good talking to you, and I hope it's been helpful for the listeners.
Thank you.